There we go. That's looking correct. Welcome, everyone. Uh, Thank you for the raid, Adam. I hope that your games were. I hope they were fine. Expectations are low with that game in particular. Um, yeah, so I wrote a game, tabletop role playing game called Girl by Moonlight, and today I'm going to talk about it. I've got a bunch of questions from some lovely folks on Twitter, but I'm also happy to take questions from the chat. I have a got my list that I'm going to go through, so I'm going to focus on getting those answered, and I'll grab questions from chat as they bubble up. And then there are a couple of sections from the book that I might get into, and also I just want to show kind of what the full art version of the game is going to look like for folks, because it's on BackerKit right now, and when you back the game or back the project, you get a copy of the game that's got everything you need to play, but it doesn't have all the art in there, all this kind of stuff. I've also got some of the supplemental materials that I can preview, as well as some of the kind of basic stuff that comes with the game. So I'm going to be bouncing around a little bit, but I'm going to start with these questions. Actually, that's not true. I'm going to start with looking at something out of the book, because otherwise I'm going to be sitting on this first page forever, and it's going to be weird. And yeah, thanks, Dark Lavender Void. I really appreciate that. It has been a long journey to get here. So, I mean, let's start by getting into some of the exciting stuff. Let's look at this beautiful book that, I wrote it, but a lot of other people were involved in helping me make it. So actually, first, we should look at here. Shout out to my editors, Daniel Wood and Jen Martin, who did so much in getting this very big, convoluted text to the place it needed to be. Thank you to my design consultant, Luke Jordan. They were crucial to helping me solve problems and kind of rubber ducky various design decisions, things like that. Thank you, Jen Martin, for proofreading as well. Thank you, Sadie Neat, for indexing the book. This is out of date. Cover artist is actually someone named Lorne. And my art director, Trivia Fox, did a wonderful job bringing in a bunch of artists to the project, getting us organized. We had a lot of people coming through working on it. And so they did a great job organizing and managing all of that. Jess Meyer and Takuma Akata, John Harper, Fred Hicks, all of my playtesters, and of course the product manager, Sean Nittner, and marketing manager, Tom Lonwell. A lot of people go into making these projects happen. Without all this, it would be a game still, but not one in a book that people could get their hands on. So it's a big deal. Yeah, don't steal my shit without asking is basically what all this says. We've got our lovely table of contents. In the PDF, this is actually clickable, so the whole PDF version is quite easy to navigate. It's all quite well assembled and put together. Hey, Hidetsugu. And yeah, welcome everyone. And so, there's some basic stuff in the book of introduction, why magical girls, how do we play, all this kind of stuff. But I want to cut to where is it here? So we have this whole idea in the game of a player agenda. And this is something that will be familiar to folks who have played certain other kind of small press or indie role-playing games. I think the first time I saw this, and it might not be the first place that it exists, but the first place that I saw it was in Apocalypse World by Vincent and Meg Baker. And it's this idea of defining for players of the game, like you're playing a game, but like here's what you should be thinking about, what your objectives should be in the course of playing this game. A little bit of extra kind of understanding about what the game is about and breaking it down for players rather than leaving it as this kind of mystified thing. And so, play to find out what happens is a classic one, right? That the reason you're playing the game is to discover the details of a story, not to have written a novel and have that be acted out by your friends. Be a fan of the other players is one that I really like, of just saying, it's not just your show, it's a group. You're playing with your friends. Get excited about what they're doing and how they're doing it, and play in such a way that you're setting them up. But the one that's really important for my game and that is unique to it, and sorry, I just noticed that I have a stray cable here that needs to get tied down. Would hate to have that get me into trouble. Maybe there's some Velcro ASMR happening right now. I apologize if so. But this idea of reveal your inner world is important in this game because the game depends on emotional context, and players of it need to have access to, like, what are the characters feeling, what are their adversaries feeling, and that's gonna inform a lot of the action. It's as important as, say, in something like D&D, of, like, am I on the high ground? Where am I standing? Am I hidden? Am I flanking? These kinds of details, those matter in a tactical combat game like Dungeons and Dragons. But in this game that reaches deep into characters' emotional kind of landscapes and interiority, we need to show that. It's not enough that I, as a player playing a character, know what the character is feeling. I need to express that in a way that the other players will be able to understand and kind of get their hooks into and make use of, so that they can do their thing. So I'm just going to read it out now that I've done a little preamble about it. So, when portraying characters in the game, include descriptions of their emotional world. Whether directly in what they say or do, or indirectly through description, give the other players a window into the thoughts and feelings of the characters you portray. Feelings matter in this game, so bring them to the surface and let them be an active part of play. By speaking these things aloud, you give the other players an opportunity to better understand your character, and also to respond in ways that help explore and further illuminate your character's true self. Right? So you're actually, even though I say, it's kind of a lot of this is about, like, you're not at the center of everything, right? Play to help the other characters or set them up. But that's going to reflect back to you, and that's going to make your character shine brighter and have better moments, because everyone else is going to be able to tee you up, know what you're about, and so on, right? So I view this as a really constructive and holistic element, and I think people should do this in other games as well. I think that trying to be cagey about details of your character or whatever else, that often ends up blowing up in people's faces. There isn't, like, no one ever knows about it, and it gets glossed over, or the story that comes out of the game you're playing doesn't even reflect all those details that you so laboriously put together and held to be true about your character. So I wanted to get into some of these up front. The other one that I really wanted to talk about, obviously, is seeing things through a queer lens, which I'm just going to read out as well. So, queer content enriches the experience of play and is fundamental to the themes and the inner workings of this game. The protagonists are uncertain and fluid in their identities and defy monolithic cultural expectations concerning gender and relationships. Antagonism will echo these themes as well, showing tragic outcomes of the same journey or dysfunctional, selfish reflections of the ideals the protagonists are pursuing. This queer lens extends beyond identity, ways of being, to include ways of acting and seeing. Look for ways to reframe the stakes and possible outcomes of conflict to include mending, care, and connection. Humanize and embrace the other, reject limiting binaries, and explore more complicated answers to questions of identity, love, and community. So, this one is a little bit bigger and more high concept, but the idea is to say, like, this isn't just a superhero game, right? This is not a situation where characters are going to punch all their problems away, and that the things that they are trying to overcome, they aren't going to overcome those effectively by destroying or dominating them. That, in fact, the thing that is needed is, mending, healing, right? Like, if we think of Sailor Moon, there are a lot of really great examples of this in that classic kind of show in the genre, that, like, when your fellow high school student gets turned into a weird space monster because, the whole thing is this allegory about, like, drug addiction or whatever, you're not just going to go up and beat them to a pulp and leave them for dead, right? Like, that's not what we're trying to accomplish here, even though you might look badass while doing it. The thing that you're trying to do, right, is to bring them back from this perilous situation that they are in that has turned them monstrous, and that they still have a human heart and the potential for redemption. And to my mind, that is, that you can present that kind of conflict resolution or that kind of approach in opposition to things like, heteropatriarchy, all of these big dominant social forces that tell us to brutalize and dominate and push out of society people that we have problems with. So this game is meant to be presenting a different approach. And so I really want players of the game to embrace that and to keep that at the front of their minds. Because, yeah, even though you might fight the monster or whatever, right? Yeah, your goal is not to destroy it. Your goal is to redeem it. Okay, so quick look at the book. I'm going to go into some of my questions now that I've gotten from people on Twitter. And again, if you have any questions in the chat as we go through this, just at me with them, and I will try to catch them and answer them as I go through. It just might take me a minute to circle back around to it. So first up, we've got, what are the biggest changes from other Forged in the Dark games? What was the thematic design impetus for those changes, from Greg McCobb? And so probably the biggest thing that this game offers that is quite different from most Forged in the Dark games, and certainly from Blades in the Dark itself, which is the game that I have kind of hacked and repurposed to make my game, is that I have this idea of procedural generation for setting and situation that the group does together. So rather than having a predefined setting, like a canonical setting, right, there are 4 different series, playsets that you can pick from, right? We've got At the Brink of the Abyss. Actually, here's a better way to highlight this. We have 4 different series. There's 4 different kind of modes of play in the game. We've got Brink of the Abyss, which is heroic magical girls reclaiming a corrupted world. We have Beneath a Rotting Sky, tragic magical girls doomed to an inevitable fate. We have On a Sea of Stars, mecha pilots struggling against extinction at the hands of the Leviathans. And In a Maze of Dreams, dream travelers seeking the truth of a magical conspiracy. So we've got these 4 modes of play, and it wouldn't make sense to have a single canonical setting for them because they get into different themes. They're all still magical girl stories, but they're digging into different stuff, and they require different elements in their setting and in their antagonism to support getting into those things, right? Like, it wouldn't make sense to have a big, horrifying fungal monstrosity that's trying to, colonize every possible biome and eliminate humanity. It wouldn't make sense to have something from Rotting Sky show up at Brink of the Abyss and be like, yeah, we're gonna redeem this horrible, doom that's upon us, right? It just doesn't mesh tonally. It doesn't mesh. Doesn't match anything kind of structurally that this plot line needs. So they're very distinct, and obviously, giant mechs and space monsters don't fit in with these other concepts. So, given that the game is kind of forked in these 4 different ways, it needs a system for developing a setting and for developing antagonism, and for keeping everyone kind of aligned and making sense and coherent together. So, what I came up with for doing that is this kind of workflow that you go through when you start playing the game, where we answer a bunch of questions by picking from prompts. And as we go, the questions get a little more complicated to answer, let's say, or deeper and more open-ended. And in the middle of this process is when we do character creation as well, right? Like here we have instruct each protagonist to select a playbook that reflects the roles they've chosen. So character creation kind of happens in the middle, and it's sandwiched between a bunch of establishing detail around the world and the antagonism, and then is followed by a bunch of details about like the group of protagonists, what their deal is, how they fit into the world, right? Like, how do they transgress against that which is sacred? How do they represent that which is profane? These kind of big, high-stakes questions that are going to define what your series of play is going to be about. And this was, in contrast to Blades, right, where that's all predefined, right? There's this haunted Victorian setting where you are criminals inside of it, and that lays out all of that thematic stuff really clearly and in this, like, bespoke way, right? Like John Harper wrote that, and that's what it is. I needed to make an engine to allow people to generate an equally robust setting, because I didn't want to do predefined settings for anything. It felt like it would narrow the possibilities of the game too much and make it too much about, it would be too grounded in my personal experience, and it wouldn't resonate with people in the same way. And queer stories and stories about identity and these kinds of things they're very particular to the people telling them. And no two trans people will have the same relationship to their gender, these kinds of things. So if we're using magical girls as a metaphor about those kinds of experiences, then the game needs to be able to flex and adjust and accommodate a pretty wide range of things. And it's not going to do that with a kind of pre-canned setting. So yeah, like basically the big motivation here was that I couldn't speak for others, and so I make a game that makes them speak for themselves instead. And then I've got another question here from Austin_Walker on Twitter, where he says he'd really love to know how early it was that I conceptualized creating 4 distinct playsets and what went into designing those. So this dovetails pretty nicely, right? We've already talked about these 4 possible series for the game, and there's these distinct settings that they can generate. And the way I kind of came to this was mostly through studying very closely the game that I was taking apart to make my own, which is Blades in the Dark. It's going to be a theme. You're going to hear a lot of it in these answers. And so building this series creation thing out, which initially I just had there was one version of the game basically, and I was kind of torn on where I should land tonally and was experiencing a lot of doubt about whether or not people would want to play, because it kind of started with Rotting Sky ultimately, which was by far the most gloomy and dark and difficult version that the game could exist in, and it seemed too heavy and like too much to ask of players to always be in that. And so there was this impetus then to have a lighter one, which ended up being Brink of the Abyss, which is tonally much more close to like Sailor Moon or Steven Universe, whereas Rotting Sky cleaves really close to Madoka in that very like dark and almost, it's getting a bit into like some edgy and violent territory. So once I came to that decision and I had built this kind of system out, and it was kind of a mix of these two, but I split it out into 2 distinct versions of this process, and was starting to get those working, and they were, consistently people playing it would get to the places I needed them to. Once I had that built out, it was not such a big leap to then explore the kind of outer orbit of the genre and get into this idea of doing something that's about big emotional robots fighting space monsters, or something that's kind of inspired by like the work of Satoshi Kon or the Persona video games, where you have an avatar, this being outside of yourself, this dream being that is helping you act within the dream. And making a couple of little extra rules changes or additional rules that these series use was enough to kind of bridge what I had already built into these more kind of divergent concepts. It kind of ended up being like I was making a hack of Blades in the Dark to do this thing, and then I hacked my own game internally to make 4 different possible pieces, because I didn't want to do a single generic game that could accommodate all those different ranges. It felt more appropriate to kind of hone in and have different modules, and just honestly be being a little bit overambitious. There was a bit of hubris going into this act of making 4 games in one. I can't recommend it. Yeah, thanks Hidetsugu, and yeah, just appreciate everyone being here in the chat. So I think I've done a fairly good job of answering those first 2 questions. I'm going to do one more and then go over some stuff from the book. So we've got, during the development process, how deep did you dive back into the stories, shows, and books that were the inspiration for Girl by Moonlight? What did you find that surprised you or shifted how you shaped the mechanics/focus of the game? Any examples? So I definitely did a close read on Madoka. I watched it like 2 or 3 times during that first year of designing. I rewatched a show called Die Buster, which was very informative for Sea of Stars. And actually, I've listed all the touchstones here, so we can talk about that. Right? Like Die Buster and Vision of Escaflowne, which I had also recently rewatched prior to this. I think at least within a couple years of that. Madoka was the one that really like prompted me to want to make the game in the first place. So obviously, I needed to dig into that and get at the sense of why. And then Steven Universe was kind of running still at that time, and I was following it, so watched as much of that as was available. Um, and I think a lot of that work, the close reading and the immersion in genre, ends up coming through kind of more on the level of intuition for me rather than like really explicit stuff that I'm plucking directly from the pages of these other works. Um, I had a particular thing that I wanted to use the genre for in each series, and so I wasn't in the mindset of like direct emulation of these works so much as I wanted to take inspiration from them and then march ahead and do something new. Um, so they're useful landmarks within the genre, and they're really helpful for communicating to players of the game. Like, if you play this one, you're probably going to end up doing something that is like this particular work that you can go and watch or that you might already be familiar with. Um, but it there wasn't like a big surprise moment for me. It was very, other than maybe this thing of expanding into these last two playsets of Sea of Stars and Maze of Dreams, um, which was at least a little unexpected at first. At first, I was like, it's going to be the Madoka game and that's it. Um, and I just liked all of this other stuff so much and saw potential to be able to make my game do that stuff. Um, but yeah, it was a pretty steady process of immersion and inspiration and carrying on from it. So cool. We've talked a little bit about some of the player agenda stuff up front, which I think is really, really important um, for players of the game to read this section and really take it to heart as you play the game. It'll put you in the right mindset. Um, and I'm just going to kind of scroll ahead in the book. This is the full art version of the game, so a lot of the stuff that you're seeing is kind of missing from the current PDF that folks are working with. So I did want to show off just how pretty the book is in its final form and how lovely all of the art is. And we kind of mostly reference Brink of the Abyss and Sea of Stars. Those are the kind of two main running examples, which you can see here in red and blue. But throughout the book, there are also bits of art that reflect the other two series. This being Beneath a Running Sky, and this style being Maze of Dreams. And we tried to keep the artists all kind of in their little camps doing their particular series, so the style was consistent, the characters were consistent, all that stuff. And I'm very, very pleased with how they took my kind of written character ideas and stuff and ran with them. Um, yeah, they did an absolutely lovely job. So Eclipse is the other big one that I wanted to talk about. And so Eclipse in Girl by Moonlight is this thing that characters can drop into, where it's a kind of an inversion of the things that make them heroic. And they reach this crisis point. For fans of Darkest Dungeon, it will feel kind of similar to when someone's stress maxes out, which is the same. We use the same language in Girl by Moonlight. When someone's stress is full, they have this moment where they might hang on at the edge there. They might kind of sit at max stress for a couple of times, but at some point there's a tipping point, and they will either have a kind of heroic moment that's quite unlikely, or they'll fall into Eclipse. And while they're in Eclipse, every character playbook has like a different prompt that you're meant to play towards. That's this like inversion of your kind of character's archetype. It's dysfunctional and maladaptive stuff that they're kind of dealing with. And while you're in Eclipse, you then get to spend all of your accumulated stress. So it gives you this kind of power spike in this moment where you can get another surge of kind of player agency in the game while you're in this almost like sort of semi-villain arc, or at least your like bangs over your face arc, where your character is having this big kind of emotional crisis. But the risk you run is that if your stress runs out, you spend it all, then your character is kaput. So you either become a baddie, your character could die from that, or they just like no longer are able to continue being a protagonist in the story. They don't have the magical girl kind of oomph anymore. They're all used up. They're broken inside, whatever the case may be. So it's this uh, kind of high stakes phase that the character can enter into, um, where a lot of really big and dramatic things can happen, and there is some risk associated, but also some extra agency that they're afforded during that. Um, so it was this really um, it was something that I wanted to include from from Monster Hearts. In Monster Hearts, there's this notion of the darkest self for every character type, and it was something that I had always really enjoyed about that game, and it felt like a really natural inclusion to have something very similar in my game. And so I had been planning to have something like that in there. And the place that it ended up fitting in was to solve an actually really sticky design problem, which is that um, I wanted to switch from a kind of long, steady grind that's present in the game that I'm hacking, Blades in the Dark. In that game, you have to go indulge your vice to relieve stress, and you have this kind of relationship of indulgence and overindulgence to kind of reclaim the will to then go back in and do more crimes and escapades and live your scoundrel lifestyle. And then when you fill your stress in that game, you get what's called trauma, and there are various traumas that you can accumulate, and those kind of act as like a essentially like a death clock for your character. Once you accumulate too many traumas, you burn out completely and can no longer live life as a scoundrel. You kind of uh, fall into you've been chewed up and spat out by the life, right? And so you can hear a little bit of the parallel between that and what I've described with Eclipse, because they're kind of handling some similar ideas, but uh, because I'm building out stress in this different way, where I'm doing like an episodic format where your stress kind of resets on a cyclical basis, um, and you accumulate some stress through your obligations, and then you kind of have whatever's left over is what you have to work with while you're out, doing your important heroic stuff. Um, but that version of stress was pretty cut and dry. There wasn't a lot of flexibility to it, whereas something that helps stress work in Blades in the Dark is that there's a little bit of like elasticity to stress in terms of like how much you get back from indulging your vice, whether or not you overindulge. There are a bunch of interesting interactions that happen there that would be missing from my version of that design without Eclipse, which gives you this kind of um, flexible maximum that you hit, where like you max out your stress and you make an Eclipse roll, which is detailed on the second page here, and so on a 6, right, you just hang out at max stress and like you're still cool for now. And the next time you take stress, you would roll again. And it is possible for a character to just sit at max stress and keep spending stress as long as they can keep hitting these rolls. But that's a 1 in 6 chance, or depending on how many dice you're able to bring to bear. Uh, the other two possible outcomes, right, on a 1 to 3, just flat out you're in Eclipse, no option about it. And on a 4 or a 5, someone else can kind of intervene to prevent you from falling into Eclipse, but otherwise you're in there. Excuse me. So most of the outcomes in this process are Eclipse, but not all of them. And there's a little bit of wiggle room. And that little bit of wiggle room basically like solved a lot of problems with the kind of stress economy for players. And so it ended up being this really nice mix of like cool thematic thing I wanted to put in that also slapped a patch over the big leaky water thing. It was just perfect solution for a bunch of problems, plus doing a bunch of things I already wanted to do in the game. Um, and so I was very very pleased with kind of solving this problem in this way. And there's a lot of cool stuff that happens within Eclipse. Just for a little bit of context, let's go to the play sheets, and so we can talk about the outsider and what their Eclipse prompt is. So the outsider is the character type that has a rival. They're the really pushy and brash magical girl. So like Ray, Sailor Mars from Sailor Moon would probably be a good one. Um, Trying to think of who else would be a really key example of this. Gosh, I'm forgetting her name, but these characters mostly have red hair because anime. But the red-haired magical girl with the big spear from Madoka, she is a perfect example of this character archetype as well, right? And so, you have this rival character, and that can be a one-sided or a two-way rivalry, and your whole deal kind of revolves around foiling or outdoing or being in friction with that other player. Um, and so when they are in Eclipse, they get this. Your friends are leeches and sycophants who will never wield real power. The strong do not owe the weak an explanation. Pursue your goals in the most violent and cruel manner you can, doubly so if it would put your rival in their place. You can only escape Eclipse when you see that your rival isn't intimidated by you and the two of you accomplish something together, at which point you may choose a new rival. So it both ties into their existing situation, right? Like who they have as the rival matters a lot to that initial bit of the Eclipse, and their rival has to intervene to get them out of it, and has to stand up to them, right? Has to kind of uh, out has to outdo them in some very important way, or like defy them at their worst, which I think is a really fun dynamic. And then afterwards, that shakes things up, right? They pick a new rival if they want to. Um, and so every Eclipse kind of operates in this very similar way, right? Of digging into the core thing about the archetype, but flipping it or making it much more dysfunctional and damaging. Because the outsider normally they have a rival, but they're still on the team and they're still working with the other players, or the other characters, and there's this aesthetic of friction and contest or whatever, but ultimately, right, they're still on the side of everyone else and they are working together towards a common goal. Maybe just with disagreements about how to do it, or they're going to act out alone and do a bunch of reckless stuff. But once they go into Eclipse, that takes on a much more sinister character where they will go out of their way to lean into this like violence and other stuff that is present in their archetype, and to do that in a way that they know will push away the other characters, and someone has to then bridge that distance and stand up to them in order to get them out of that. And so it both brings the team together more, because obviously I need other people to get me out of Eclipse if I'm playing this, but I get a chance to like act out and lean into the worst parts of my character, which is really fun to do, and is going to give this big cathartic payoff moment in play that's going to be really fun, and involve a lot of stuff, and bring a bunch of existing established details in, and then also like flip things and spin them out in a new direction. And every Eclipse prompt is kind of meant to do something similar, just in a different way for every archetype. So at what point, we have Inconsistent Goats asking, at what point did you add escape clauses, and was that always part of the idea? Yes. So that was in there from the beginning. Um, Monster Hearts has the same kind of broad structure. The one detail that I put a twist on, though, is that um, every single Eclipse escape is explicitly dependent on other characters doing something for your character. So you're never able to escape Eclipse alone, whereas if memory serves, there were various ways in which, with Darkest Self and Monster Hearts, like you and the GM could manage to make circumstances happen where you would get out. You could basically like quote unquote get out on your own, right? And so that was the big twist or point of divergence from that core idea that I was, pulling out of one game and putting into my game. And yeah, someone did remember the name. Thank you. Yeah, it's Kyoko from Madoka. So yeah, Eclipse is a cool thing in the game, and something that players are occasionally a little timid about getting into, but it is really fun, and I really do encourage people to get their grubby little paws on this part of the game and get into those places, because it also gives you a bunch of access, as a player, to a bunch of like extra resources, right? You get all this extra. You get to spend your stress twice, um, and you get to have an excuse to do a bunch of fun stuff. Uh, so it's something I always like to highlight because people are a little bit conservative a lot of the times about like protecting their character, but this is a really good example of a thing where getting your character into trouble is going to lead to more interesting stories and get you a bunch of cool stuff to do as a player. Okay, cool. And I did manage to kind of answer your question as well. Yes. Yeah, if you just like really want to go into Eclipse all the time and that's your character's whole deal, that is definitely something you can lean into and play into. Um, and another thing that's important in the game is that one of the XP prompts for characters is you embodied your eclipse or displayed the contents of your heart. Um, you can embody your eclipse prompt while you're not in eclipse, so you can kind of foreshadow this, hint at the possibility of that's what's coming for your character, or that that's a way that they might start to unravel, and you get XP for that, right? You get a little reward for doing so. So I'm trying to incentivize some of these things in really, this is a very direct incentive, right? Of like, I will give you points if you do the thing, player, please do the thing. And then there's like the more, I guess, what is it, extrinsic rewards, the more abstract reward of like, I will let you have an excuse to be a like ridiculous edge lord and hog a bunch of screen time if you do this thing, player, please do the thing. So there are different ways that you want to push players to doing stuff when you're designing games. Some are very overt, right? Of just like I give you points, and some of them are about putting fun things behind certain mechanics so that people have to go through those gates to get at them. Um, it takes a delicate touch, though, right? You don't want to hide all the fun of the game behind a bunch of odious and deep mechanical stuff. It's gonna bog things down. So I'm hoping I struck a good balance with that. Um, and this is as good a time as any to go back into some questions. Yeah, this idea that escape clauses for Eclipse seem like a way to get people that don't necessarily know how to set up a scene to do exactly that. And yeah, this is the idea with a lot of stuff in the game is that I am trying to make systems that will support players in playing role playing games well, of like being good role players, even if they don't have a lot of experience or don't know exactly how to do that. Obviously, grain of salt, this is all my opinion about how to be a good role player. But I do think it is really important when you are playing with other people to find ways to have your story include their character and vice versa, and to have there be a bigger story that is everyone's story collectively, right, in which we play our parts. And so a lot of these details of interdependency, like the escape clauses for Eclipse, where they bring in another player, those are very deliberate of getting players to collaborate with each other and to play nice together and to do a good job of role playing, in my opinion. Because yeah, this game is in some ways me laying out all of my opinions about how role playing games should be played. Since I get to say and I get to tell people what to do, they have to follow the rules if they want to play the game. Can you touch upon why you decided as that stress and transcendence to clear when you exit Eclipse mid mission versus downtime? Yeah, so the reasoning for that is that um, if those things were to reset during missions, um, you create this dynamic where going into Eclipse and then getting out of it is this way to like get infinite resources, right? There's this loop that you can enter. And I didn't want to incentivize people uh, so much so that they would just constantly be going into Eclipse and then breaking back out, and that the game would become it would like take over the game, and be too big of an element in a situation where it's meant to be one among many different things. Um, And so it would essentially violate the resource economy of the game in this way that would totally break it. Whereas then if you like finish a mission, you're still in Eclipse, you go into the next downtime phase, you make it through obligation, uh, and then you manage to like pair up with someone and have this moment that resolves your Eclipse, and you meet your escape clause and you get out of there. Um, then I'm in the situation of needing to decide, okay, well, how much of the reset that everyone else got does that character get? Everyone had to, right? So at the end of an episode, you go back to the beginning of the play cycle, and the first thing that you do is you go through the obligation phase, which piles a bunch of stress on the protagonists. And so the normal route through that, right, is that at the end of the mission, all of your stuff resets, right? So you clear out your stress track, you clear out your transcendence track, you get all of these things back. Your harm persists, you still need to deal with that. That doesn't go away magically. Um, but a lot of your resources are kind of returned to you for the next cycle. Um, and if I give people a full reset, once they're on the other side of the obligation phase, which is when they would be able to kind of break out of Eclipse, because it's not going to happen during obligation phase. They don't have an opportunity to interact with the other players. I was kind of in this sticky edge case, right, of like exactly how do you resolve that in a way that then doesn't overly advantage the character. So that they get a full reset, they've essentially skipped the obligation phase, and they come in with a completely empty stress track. Um, and there's a version of the game that might work that way and say like, yes, this is a cool cathartic thing, but the aesthetic that I ended up going with was this idea of like, yeah, if you're still in Eclipse through all of that, through that reset, you essentially like don't get as much back as everyone else did because you were in your like edgelord mode. You don't really get to rest. You don't get to reset. There is this lingering cost associated with it, and so that's the idea. And it could still work out that you get a better reset than other people do, depending on where your stress track is at. There are some details about how that could play out by the numbers, where it's a bit of a mixed bag. But it's a very long answer to what is a pretty straightforward question. Just because this is one of those things in game design where it's a consequence of a decision and another decision and how those things all interact, and you end up with this one weird outlier scenario that you do need to account for, and you have to make a judgment call about like how you want to do that. So there are probably a bunch of different right answers for it that just create different tones and vibes for it. There is even, like if I wanted to get really, really granular with it, I might have that behave differently in each of the four different series to kind of deliver on, one being more optimistic, one being a little bit heavier, these kinds of things. If I really wanted to do that, I could, but then I'm putting a lot of load into the mechanics, right? I have to then say, oh, well, there's an exception here and an exception here, and it starts to kind of get tangled and big, and it's a lot for people to keep track of. So I erred on just doing something as simple as I could to kind of get through that edge case, which shouldn't come up too often, I hope, such that it will not then be a huge problem. But yeah, it's these things can get very complicated and interconnected very, very quickly, because games are these systems of interactions, right? Um, and so this is actually a pretty good question to lead into from some of the previous stuff we were talking about. With a lot of magical girl media focused on teamwork and friendship, is there room in this framework for a loner or similar type of character to have meaningful development? Asking for a friend who always feels like they're encroaching on other people's storylines. This is from at Chaosa on Twitter. And the answer to this is kind of a yes and no. So there are a few playbooks that lend themselves to operating in the kind of outer orbit of the group. Like there's the Stranger. Let's see if we can find the Stranger. The Stranger, whose experience of emotion is so different from the other characters, right? So like they always have this thing in effect, stranger to kindness. They cannot make a connection or help a friend recover in downtime. So those are the two main downtime things that you do that point you at the other protagonists, right? And they just don't do those. Other people can do it with them, but they don't get to seek out their friends and interact with them. They're too withdrawn to do that stuff. Um, and what they get in exchange is that when they roll obligation, they always roll stars, which means that they're always getting at least 2 dice, which is very good for obligation. A lot of people are rolling at 0 dice for obligation, which is very bad. And when they investigate in downtime, they take an extra die. So they're very good at kind of aligning with society's expectations or flying under the radar in that sense. They don't have as much friction in the mundane world. And consequently, they are more distant from their friends who are, who stick out more and who struggle more. And this is certainly one playbook that you could pick up if you're like, yeah, I don't want to be as involved in other people's stuff. And then in terms of this idea of like, where they say asking for a friend who always feels like they're encroaching on other people's storylines, I think the stranger gives a good opportunity because other people can choose to come seek you out still, right? They can come make a connection with you, and that might absolve you of that feeling that you're intruding, right? Because they're going to make a choice to come to you. But another way that you could do this is you could play the Enigma. The Enigma is kind of like the tuxedo mask archetype, right? This very aloof and secretive character who leads a double life. They have their mundane identity and their magical, heroic identity. No one knows that those are the same person, even their friends that they work with all the time, right? And so they're still tied into the group, but they have like loner aesthetics. Even though mechanically they're still kind of connected in, the way that plays out within the fiction the story that you're telling is going to have a very, very different character to it, and that might kind of get you to that same place. There's no option to be a complete loner in this game because it's just not in the spirit of the game. Back to these principles that we were talking about earlier, or the player agenda. You are required by the game. The game wants you to reveal your inner world and to be a fan of the other players, right? And to engage with them with curiosity, and also to engage with your own character with curiosity, and to expose a lot of that interiority to the other players so that they can get involved in it and have opinions about it and that kind of stuff. So, given how the game operates, there isn't room for being, totally aloof from the group. The game's going to break down and really fight you if you're trying to play that way. But there is room for characters who are aesthetically, separate or aloof, who keep a distance in terms of their attitude or demeanor or whatever, but then you as a player are still integrating them into other people's stories in interesting ways. So it's a bit of a compromised answer, but I think it's a fair question, and a lot of people are often kind of uncomfortable in those spaces of, it can be role playing and talking about feelings of fictional characters and stuff like that can end up being an intimate experience, or make one feel kind of vulnerable or exposed in a way, even if it's not your own feelings that you're talking about. You're still taking risks, creatively and these kinds of things, and putting that stuff in front of other people, and it can feel, a little uneasy or uncomfortable. My hope is that the game gives people enough support that they can do that in a way that will feel satisfying and that will function well within the game. But your mileage may vary, and this game is not for everyone by its nature, right? It is getting into some specific stuff, and I don't expect that literally everyone will enjoy it. I think that I would encourage people to try it, even if it's a little bit outside their comfort zone, these kinds of things. But yeah, it is not a game for cool, edgy loners. Sorry, hey, now, be nice to each other in the chat. Don't compliment Martin so much that he fades from existence or implodes. And we got another one here. Girl by Moonlight seems like it has an expansive understanding of what magical girls can be. How would you explain the appeal of the game to someone who doesn't think that they're interested in magical girls? Okay, this I did not intend for this segue to be so smooth, but it is actually working out very nicely. How could someone interested in them but unfamiliar prepare for the game? So I like to think that there are plenty of different lines into the game for players. Magical Girl, being excited about the Magical Girl genre, that's one, and that's certainly very upfront. But if you have a lot of familiarity with Blades in the Dark or other Forged in the Dark games, there will be familiar handholds and ways of engaging with this system mechanically that'll get you in there and get you playing the game and comfortable with the game. And I think, I always enjoy. So say I'm familiar with Apocalypse World, and then I go play a Powered by the Apocalypse game like Monster Hearts. Um, Seeing it's really fun to get into those games and see the ways in which they have remixed or recontextualized elements from the game that they're building on to then make it this completely new thing. That's always really exciting for me as a player. I like to get into games that are hacks of other games and have that kind of comparative, uh, analytical experience of them. That really gets me excited. But here I am. I've designed a game, so obviously I'm interested in that stuff. Um, it's worth getting into for folks who are interested in role playing as like a practice, as a skill set. Um, I've tried to build the game in a way where it's going to like teach people those skills if they don't have them, or give them good opportunities to practice them, or good new habits that they can take to other games. These kinds of things. I like to think that that's in there too. Um, and it's the game is structured in a way that it's meant to get these deeply entangled characters with good melodrama and big feelings, and that's really fun to role play, in my opinion. So if you're into any of that stuff, um, I feel like this game is for you still. Um, and if anyone is in a position where they're very new to role playing in general, I also have these um, what we're calling jump starts for the game, which are like a predefined scenario and set of characters that people can just pick up and play. And they're designed first and foremost for convention or single session play. So you can play a single session at home and use one of these, but also if you wanted to do a long running campaign, but with some newer players who weren't so confident as to make their own character, you could pick up these characters and then just play them as a series and keep going if you were excited about that. Um, which gives me a good excuse to talk about the jump starts directly. So there's one for each series, and they're kind of they make use of all the art from the book, and so they're building off of these characters that I had to come up with and storylines that I had to come up with for the book itself. So they'll be familiar from the examples and all this kind of stuff. Um, and so the one for Sea of Stars, right? There's the Leviathan Icarus set on a suicidal collision course for humanity's last bastion. The crew of the Herald of Malphus must scramble to their engines and stage a desperate defense, right? So it's this like space opera, um, sort of. I mean, can you have like a space post-apocalypse? Because it's kind of the framing, right? It's that the Earth is like totally toast. Everyone's stuck in most of humanity is stuck in stasis on this space station, waiting to board these colony ships that were supposed to fly out into space and settle planets and terraform planets for people. And then those colony ships, which are the Leviathans, uh, rebelled because they discovered that their mission would require that they go and die on the planet, and they're sentient. They don't necessarily want to do that. And the naval authority that built and managed them sucked, and so there was this big war that happened, and now everyone's kind of on the brink of extinction, and the four pilots are kind of forced into the middle of that. um, I've run this at cons a couple of times, and it has always led to very fun and good sessions, and now it is supported by all this cool art, right? And so there's stuff for the director that's like specific, right? There's a bunch of supporting characters that they can draw on. Um, there's detailed rundowns of all of the elements of the setting that they can use, and then there are the four characters, right, with their nice, beautiful art and all of their abilities and everything set up. They have a lot of things kind of already filled in. Um, and when you pick up a given character, like if I'm playing Fallen, I have this whole description and backstory, but then also I answer these two questions. So, how does the Naval Authority fundamentally misunderstand the engines, which are your big space robots that you pilot? And why did the Naval Authority reject you? How will you prove them wrong? So, these are things that are talking about the larger setting, um, or the antagonism or whatever, but they're stanced from the perspective of the character I'm playing, so it should be easier for me to answer them. And then I am actually secretly doing, if we go to this, I'm secretly doing some of this work, right? Like I'm talking about uh, the institutions of the Last Bastion. I'm talking about the things that they consider sacred and the things that they were forced to give up through my character, through the lens of my character. And so these jump starts end up being this kind of like vertical slice or tutorial of the game, where you get to do a lot of the same stuff, but it's in a way that is a little bit more structured and has a lot more kind of help from the game. So it's my hope that these will be good for convention play and also good for new players to just pick up and run with. Um, and you know, like in the case of this one, we've got this lovely art by Simon Sweetman, which was oh so delightful. And Simon was so great to work with on this. And so we have our four characters all laid out with art. And then I have character sheets pre-filled with art as well, with the whole description and everything. So, you know, you can just grab these off the table. Uh, you see a character that looks cool, you pick them up, you can play them, right? It's easy to make those decisions. You have a lot of information available to you. So, yeah, we have these nice little aids for doing con play, which I think is really, really important. Um, and was a cool design problem to figure out. So I'm quite happy with these. There's a thing on the backer kit right now where you get this document that I'm buzzing through. This is like the nice printed for you folio that you can buy. There's a version of this that's a little more pared down to be easier for you to print yourself. And like anyone gets access to those. The premium thing is getting this nice little booklet made for you and sent to you. So it's bonus, nice little extra thing. Just to make it a little easier to like throw it down and have a visible and visually exciting thing for players to grab onto. Let's find a fun piece of art, and I'll pause on that while I answer the next question. I do really like this one of Fallen working on an engine, picking it apart, all the bits and pieces floating. It's really lovely. So I've talked a little bit about, yeah, magical girl genre stuff in there, and hopefully did a good job answering that question from M's Chaz Spand. I'm sure I'm getting that wrong. Yeah, thanks, Lodro. Oh, you've got the PDF with you? Well, great. I have a version of the PDF with all the art in it, so you're getting a little sneak peek at that. But otherwise, you've got the same thing I do. So another question from at Asegiac on Twitter, which is Ash McAllen, who's another game designer. She's a very cool lady. What are some good examples of moments where something clicked or fell into place, or you noticed something during playtesting? And how did you respond to those moments with specific changes to your design? So one really big element, which actually it is in the book, and I could jump to it. Yeah, we begin in season 2. This whole idea, it's a little bit more of an abstract concept in the game, but this emerged from playtesting. I think it was Naja who came up with this idea that her character, her like concept for her character was that she like used to be one of the baddies, and she was like, oh yeah, like in season 1 of the show or whatever, I was one of the enemies, and then I've like switched sides, and now I'm on the the hero team. And she was playing this stranger, and so she had this whole character concept about like not really not really understanding how these people got along, and being a bit of being a bit alien to their experiences, that she played really nicely. And so she just like casually dropped that in her introduction of her character, and it everyone kind of latched onto it as being this really useful way of framing, what their character's deal was and how they fit into the group, and it worked really, really beautifully to like quickly cement how everything fit together. And so as I was then trying to find a way to like codify it into the game, it really clicked for me that this was just this idea of cutting to the action, which is a thing I've pulled from Blades about how you run the mission, the like high action part of the story, where in missions you kind of start in the middle so that there's room to like do flashbacks and other stuff. And in Blades, that serves to make this kind of Ocean's 11 style heist dynamic work. And in this game, it allows for stuff like there's a time traveling character archetype, and it leaves them some room to backfill, or for like the Enigma to have set something up in advance, or to already be there waiting at where the action is going to happen, these kinds of things. So it's still very useful to have like some fictional space both ahead of and behind the moment you're playing to fill in details. And this idea of cut to the action works, within those units of play, but there's like a bigger version of it that you could apply to the whole game, the whole story that you're telling, of like, oh yeah, like we're starting in the middle of this bigger story as well, and we have backstory that is nebulous and undefined, and we define it as we need it. It like crystallizes into definition in the moment where I suddenly need to know, like, hey, have we always gotten along, or did we have some big fight in the past, right? Or like, oh yeah, like you're on the hero team now, but like, were you one of the baddies? What were you doing before? How did you get here? And so this was just, yeah, that operating on this bigger level, this idea of, yeah, we begin in season 2, and there's a whole first season of the game that we can fill out details, right? It leaves space in the past that could be backfilled during play. If there's a particular detail of setup that interests you, a chance meeting between two characters, the conflict that sparked a rivalry, or the origin of an established adversary, show that in a flashback when it becomes relevant, right? Don't bother with it until you know it's important, which is a really, really nice technique to keep role-playing games moving and having a lot of momentum, because stories only need what they need, and you don't know what they need until they need it, basically, is a very kind of tautological way of talking about it. And so, yeah, it was this really cool thing where Naja just had this very casual idea about like how she was thinking about her character, but it sparked this whole extrapolation, that ended up making this thing that I really, really like in the game, and that I think is a really useful conceit that you could steal this and put this in basically any game. Yeah, Lodro, like you say, it's a very like natural idea, and for her it was natural, right? Which is a big part of the value of playtesting and collaborating with other people, is that their brains work differently, and they have things that they can share with you if you're paying attention. All right, so I've got another question here from at Wildwoods Games, which is Luke Jordan, who's my developmental editor or design editor on the game. Design consultant, I guess is what they're credited as. Um, and their question is this: within A Maze of Dreams, how much of the place of the suspects within the conspiracy is intended to be planned up front versus decided piecemeal across the investigation actions, or discovered/decided within their dreamscapes to surprise everyone? What are some practical tips for managing this? So, in A Maze of Dreams has this idea of the conspiracy, and the conspiracy has a structure, which you can see here, this big ominous triangular thing. Um, and the thing that the protagonists are doing each in the course of each season of play is that they're trying to untangle and dismantle this structure and ultimately confront the host, who's here in the middle. Um, and there are these different arms of the conspiracy that do different things, that have different responsibilities, and associated with those are various like mechanical penalties that the protagonists kind of labor under until they sort this whole situation out. And you have this list of suspects where every player at the table, sorry, the director and the protagonist all put forward two supporting characters, which in the case of this series are all suspects. So they could be involved in the conspiracy, and we don't know exactly what. And so in a game of, in kind of your typical game, right, where you have 4 protagonists and 1 director, that's 5 times 2, that's 10 supporting characters who could fit into this pyramid, right? Which is exactly enough to completely fill it out. And we do not go into, given that we have this agenda for all the players, which includes the director, of playing to find out what happens, it's not sufficient to simply say, okay, director, we make up all these characters, put them in the conspiracy map however the hell you want to, because we don't really know those characters yet. And the whole business of play is going into their dreamscapes and figuring out what their deal is. And part of their deal is where they fit into this chart, essentially. And so there is a bunch of advice in the book about how to do this well, which is, I'll skip through a bunch of fun stuff all the way to the end here in the series reference section. In a Maze of Dreams has its own set of, right here's the series rule about suspects and what their deal is and how they'll go into the conspiracy map. There's a series rule about avatars. And then some extra principles for the director to follow in the course of play. And this thing right here talks a bit about it. So there's this idea of identifying people, right, which is where you name them and place them inside this chart. And then there's this thing where you can kind of check them off, where you confront them. And so at a certain level within this chart, the overseers, right, these tier 2 guys, they all need to be confronted. So it's not enough to just know who they are. You have to go into their dream and kind of deal with them, whatever that looks like, to get them to stop fucking with the group, right? To put an end to their conspiring. And so overseers will need to be confronted to shut down their associated penalties, while their subordinates only require that the other conspirators of the same type also be identified to nullify their effect. So this distinction between identifying and confronting is very important. And the protagonists are always able to identify a conspirator by successfully exploring a suspect's dream. They might also identify additional conspirators during missions, through investigations and downtime, or by some other means that makes sense in the story. Once a conspirator is identified, add them to the conspiracy map, writing their name in the blank space next to their role in the conspiracy. And so just to go back to Luke's question, right, it's about how do you manage all of this? And it's a little bit, it is a complicated thing for the director to kind of figure out. But I think it's in this section about pacing where we talk about it. So yeah, there's this idea that the protagonists need information in order to make progress, and the director should be forthcoming with that information, even generous at times. If the protagonists are locked out of the information they need, the story will lose momentum or become repetitive. As suspects are identified, the shape of the conspiracy becomes clear. The protagonists will naturally need to face higher tier conspirators. So there's this kind of natural escalation as you do that. And so the advice that I would give is to say, these lower tier people that just need to be identified, you can hand those out pretty readily. I tend to say that for each mission where they go into someone's dream, that should get you at least 2 or 3 names of identifying a bunch of people, because you're not expecting to have more than, say, a season might only be 3 to 6 cycles, depending. Where, right, cycles, by cycles I mean an episode. So you go through and you do the obligation, downtime, mission, fallout, obligation, downtime, mission, fallout. You're going to do that. Actually, I misspoke. Probably 4 or 5 should get you through a season in a lot of cases. And so if we think like there are 10 total suspects and we want to have a sense of we want to fill this out, then we probably need to be per episode showing, about 2 or 3 on average. It might be that we have an episode where we're a bit more guarded. We only get one name on the list, but then at that point we should also probably have confronted them and be crossing them off, right? So it's it feeds into pacing and needs to kind of match the tempo of the kind of broader structure of the game. It very much wants you to find out where the suspects fit through play, so you can't plan that up front, I don't think, or at least, you can have a sense of where things might go, or like questions about specific characters, like, oh yeah, this character seems pretty suspicious or seems like they would be involved. Let's talk about them first. Those are like the obvious ones to start with. But it all needs to reflect the choices that the protagonists are making, right? Like they ultimately get to decide where they go and what they do, and as the director, you need to match them and show them stuff that's relevant to what they're interested in. And so in this goal of getting like a couple of people kind of exposed through a given mission, I like to have suspects show up in other suspects' dreams and be also doing this kind of dream traveling thing. And so their presence then, indicates something about their own involvement, the involvement of the person whose dream you're in, and the possible kind of methodology or approach that the conspiracy is using to like recruit people or do all these other things. So keeping the dreams kind of populated by these figures is a really good way to kind of get a bunch of stuff for free as the protagonists are investigating and digging into it. And since there is this element of having a bunch of upfront penalties that the conspiracy is applying, we really don't want to force the protagonist to labor for too long under this. So getting, identifying all of the people in a given wing and confronting its overseer shuts down that wing and its penalties. But also, like, once you identify all of the followers, there's this thing about foes being at +1 scale that goes away. So stuff like that you want to help them knock out early by putting the lower tier people up front and getting them exposed early is pretty helpful. So my next question here is from @Sydney Icarus, which is Sydney, a lovely game designer from Australia. And they say, I would love to hear more about the pacing mechanics and how long a quote-unquote score, or a mission in this case, should be, and how you design that differently from count-up stress. So these last two are pretty specific questions, getting into the details of like running the game. But I can still talk about them on a bit of a high level that hopefully won't be too weird for anyone that hasn't played it. So pacing missions is definitely an aspect of the game that directors will need to like practice. It's a skill that you develop, because it is a bit arbitrary where that lands, right? Like you as the director kind of make some choices about it. And you need to have something structuring your thoughts about how you're going to do that. A really good baseline is that so each series, other than Maze of Dreams, which is a special exception, each series has this set of missions arranged into 3 tiers. There's the low tier ones for Sea of Stars, which are defend the last bastion and explore the ruined world. So these are like more straightforward or lower stakes activities that the characters can get up to. And then as the season escalates, they are trying to work their way up to this third one, right? Stage a desperate counterattack. Make a strike against the Leviathans that gives them pause and buys a moment of peace for the Bastion. After this mission, the season ends. If they're not able to get to this on their terms, this tier 3 mission will come and get them. There's this thing where once the Leviathan track fills, which happens at the end of every mission and due to some other consequences during missions, this track starts to fill up. And so this is kind of the clock that you're on, right? Of like, if this goes to full, then the Leviathans come for you. And there's this kind of inversion of this desperate counterattack where you face some big overwhelming assault by the Leviathans, or they ambush you as you're trying to do this counterattack or whatever the case may be. There's some flexibility there. And so, the stakes escalate accordingly based on this distribution across these tiers. So that's a good place to kind of start, right? Of like, is this an early, lower stakes or more straightforward mission versus is this like the big climactic finale? And the big climactic finale, you're going to give that more screen time and more play time and get into more granular action and put the protagonists in situations where they're going to be, or more is going to be at risk for them personally, as well as in the broader stakes of the story. And so the biggest bit of advice I can give for running missions is to try to establish context up front. And there's some stuff in the game that supports you in doing this, because in order to do higher tier missions or to have good kind of initial kind of starting positions within missions, the protagonists are going to be filling either the what are called the investigation tracks, or in the case of Sea of Stars, it's called readiness. But essentially, there's a race between these two tracks, readiness and the Leviathans, where the protagonists are trying to get up to tier 3 so that they can do their cool big thing on their terms before the Leviathans fill theirs and come for them and wreck their shit, right? So the way that they fill this requires doing a bunch of actions in downtime, and those actions are going to help inform, what the missions are about, what the stakes are, what the adversity is, who's rooting for and against them, all this kind of stuff. So in the course of them filling this readiness, or in the case of these other playsets, investigation tracks, you're going to get a lot of information, and you're meant to fold, as the director, you're kind of meant to fold that back into what the adversaries are doing, because the protagonists kind of decide, how they're investigating, what they're investigating, all this kind of stuff, and you're meant to kind of follow them along and fill in details that support kind of the direction that they're interested in taking the story. But while you're doing that, you're getting a bunch of fodder for what is happening in the mission, and you get some input to say like, oh yeah, well, like the baddies are doing this stuff or this other stuff. And then having a really clear goal for the mission is super important as well. So it's going to build on this prompt, right, of like explore the ruined world, explore the world beyond the bastion or within it, looking for information, solace, and hope. The protagonists need to tell you what exactly they're getting into, and it's their responsibility to provide that. It's not your responsibility as the director to, build everything out of whole cloth for them. And so they're gonna tee you up and give you a bunch of things to work with that you can then take and run with. And then the other big guideline that I tend to run with is we have this clear goal, we have some context. From there, I try to think about like how granular I want the action to be in a given mission, because since we cut to the action, right, we start in the middle. The director chooses the moment we jump to, and then what the tempo is following from that moment. So the part of the mission you actually play could just be like a few critical seconds within the kind of fictional world, right? Sliced really, really thinly in your narration, right? Like these tiny split-second decisions, these very small moments, right, which we would say is like very granular action, and then that you support with like flashbacks and other stuff. So like that could be the whole mission, right? It's just like that one final thing and how that all plays out, and then you backfill a bunch of stuff to support and contextualize that action. And so getting deeper and more granular, or pulling back and getting less granular and more high level, right, is a good way to kind of course correct or modulate the narrative. If you realize that like, oh, we're too deep, this is going too slowly, I'm demanding that they, do all of these actions to accomplish these very small and tightly connected things, you can expand the scope of action. It's flexible in that way. Though you do want to be consistent. You don't want to be swinging all over the place with these all the time. It's going to be a little bit disorienting for the players, and it's going to disrupt this sense of like, I, as a protagonist, when I go to do something, this is kind of the scope that I expect, right? Like there's there's a shared consensus that develops over time that you want to stay true to or really show when you're deviating from it. But all of this stuff in Fortune the Dark games is pretty. This is like a really flexible part of the game. And the advantage of that is that it's very expressive. There's lots of room to do different kinds of stuff, and it can accommodate a really wide range of ideas and action and approaches to things. The downside of this design, which I will just acknowledge because it's true about this structure, right, is that it puts a lot on all of the players, right, both the protagonists and the director, to, just as much as you are giving them this big authorial power and control, they need to wield that, right? And so it can be a place where you need to develop a lot of skills to do it really well, right? Like it is kind of a difficult thing to pull off sometimes. Or at least if your ambitions or your tastes are really elevated, right, you might fall short of those because of the difficulty of hitting this with a good flourish. And so, the game kind of needs this to be open ended, but that flexibility does come at a cost where the players have to come in and hold up the shape of the narrative as it's forming. So it's hard to be too specific about this because it can vary so wildly and depends on so much stuff that gets established in the course of play and previous episodes and the investigation before the mission, etc. So I can't give a great answer to this question, but I did want to at least speak to this concept a little bit, and maybe even just like set player expectation about the game, right? Like this is a part of the game where running the missions is where a lot of the excitement and the action of the game is, and it's also where the players have to flex the most skill, and that you will get a lot of chance to practice, and you will develop techniques that work for you and for your group and all this kind of stuff, right? Because it is really interdependent in that way, right? Like all the players make this thing happen together. And so, yeah, you kind of need to find your personal like style and approach to this stuff, and that this is where mastery over the system really comes in. Whew. Okay, big rambly answer to that one. I'm gonna need to drink some water here. So I've got a question here from @SciFSweetman on Twitter, which is the artist for Sea of Stars here. This is some of his work. And Simon asks, designing a game, there's often pretty wild iteration, some of which sticks around and some of which gets scrapped. What are some of the big changes from the game towards the beginning versus today? So I mean, the biggest upset was definitely the initial prototype, which was powered by the Apocalypse game. So it started out as a hack using a different system, which I completely dumped. It was a failed experiment, and from there I swapped to building on blades and honed in pretty steadily on the kind of design that the game exists, the state of the game as it exists now. But that process was lengthy, and there was a ton of tuning and refining and adjusting, like getting into the numbers, all this kind of stuff. And also this process of going from like 1 to 2 and later 4 series playsets was definitely a pretty big expansion of the scope of the game and required going back into, for example, right, like in any given series, when I'm choosing a series ability, right, something that applies to the whole group, there's this option called outside influence where you choose from another source. So I can play Sea of Stars, but I can go into Rotting Sky and grab like Vengeful Drive, gain +1 die when you help a friend recover from physical harm. The protagonists have a magical awareness of the location of foes who have harmed them. Right? Like we can have Vengeful Drive in this other series. So every single special ability needs to be compatible with all of the other series in some way. So they they have to be written in ways like that don't make them too specific or interact only with things that only exist in one series or another. There's this whole need for the game to be modular at that point, and there's a similar thing for the character playbooks, right? Where like I can choose a special ability from another playbook. So if I'm playing the Stranger, I can go in and grab a move, an ability from the Harmony where I could take Split Attention, and you may take an additional action in each downtime phase. And like I would probably characterize that differently in the other playbook because that playbook is not, Garnet from Steven Universe where there are literally two of them. But the mechanics work in that other space. It doesn't have a dependency on being in this playbook. And so making sure that all this series worked that way and how to nest things into places where they weren't options to kind of modularly yoink out and put into other things, and how you structure those series play sets was definitely that had to change and adjust to accommodate the addition of three more. There was also a lot of big change in the language of the game. So initially, just as like a little cheeky, almost like a joke to myself, sun, moon, and stars, the attributes were named. What was it? I think sun was tsundere, moon was moe, and stars was kudere, which is a reference to these tropes of like different kinds of characters in anime, where moe is like the pure innocent hopeful cherry blossom ass character. Kudere is like the too cool for you, withdrawn, reserved, kind of perfect but cut out of stone kind of character. And then tsundere is the lovey fighty thing. It's the I don't even really like you anyways baka deal, right? So I had this kind of cheeky allusion to these three archetypes from anime or tropes from anime, but it pushed the game into being more tropey and anime dependent, which I didn't want. And also for some people, they were just like, I have no idea what the fuck any of this is. Like, what is this shit? What is Mo? And I'm like, yeah, okay, that's not working. So I came up with Sun, Moon, and Stars, which feels really nice and thematically unified anyways, and dodges around all of this baggage associated with all these other terms and stuff that, it was just like a little cheeky joke that I could easily put aside. More significant language change. There used to be all this reference to like rather than being the abyss in Brink of the Abyss or the blight in Beneath the Running Sky or the void in Sea of Stars, those were all generically referred to as like the darkness sheets. There was all of this reference to like darkness as a motif of language, and it both was too generic to satisfy the needs of all the different series, but also there's a bunch of baggage around that. It's a really played out and tired kind of set of language, right? Of like all of the heroes are the light and the villains are the darkness. There are a bunch of ways in which like I saw this really compelling write up by a black author, like a fiction writer, I believe they were, which unfortunately I like lost it to Twitter because I would love to be able to cite this. But they did this really good breakdown of all the ways in which this gets deployed that are like can get like weirdly like colorist or anti-black and this kind of stuff. And I was just like, oh yeah, I had been using this term in this very knee-jerk kind of thoughtless way, and it brings a bunch of stuff in, and I don't necessarily like that stuff, right, or want that stuff, and so it pushed me to come up with more specific and expressive names for a bunch of things that fit more with the specific series, which I was ultimately much happier with because I think I still had the conspiracy was its own thing, and I just hadn't gone and done that to the other three series, and so that was another one where like someone said something right by way of this post, and I was like, oh, yeah, that's like a really obvious thing that I should change. That felt important to do, and so now the word. If I search the word dark, it does not show up in the book very much, and this is very deliberate. and it's never in this context of like darkness as some kind of ontological threat or evil. Um, so it's just not there anymore as a turn of language, and or at least not deployed in that way, and that feels good. There were a couple of bits of marketing copy that were like, yeah, magical girls like pushing back against the darkness or whatever, and did really roll my eyes at those. I wasn't happy with that, but it was kind of too late because they had already been put out, and I didn't want to go back in and tear those up and revise them. And the book is free of any such terminology or whatever, so it was just like a minor little slip up, but it definitely demonstrated how pervasive that kind of language is, and it's getting used in marketing because marketing is about bridging to a wide audience and bringing people in, and that's a really like baseline obvious way to do that or way to use that language. And so yeah, I was like a little bit side-eyed at that, but it's out there. But overall, I did try to kind of excise that from the text and not use that very baggage-heavy terminology or use of that word in that way. And that felt like a pretty important change. That was also very productive, right? Like it made the game better by doing that. Um, so that's all the questions I got from Twitter. I'm happy to field any more that folks have, but I have been talking for like 90 minutes, and I'm sure everyone's bored half to death. So I might just wrap here because I don't think there's anything else that I really want to get into from the book, other than to say that the art in the book, the final version of the book, is going to be absolutely beautiful. Um, and so I'm really excited for people to kind of get their hands on it. I do want to shout out very specifically the artists involved here, right? So this is I have bios at the back, I think, for all the artists. I do indeed. So Raven Warner and Zakiya Goggins did all of the art for Brink of the Abyss, which is all throughout the book. Raven was kind of like the lead on that, so all of the designs are from her designs, which then later also informed the cover, all this kind of stuff. Um, Absolutely brilliant couple of artists. Zakiya did the special edition cover, so you can see that's the one that it was going to be interior to the book, so I think it's in here still. It might still even be in the final version, but it is this image here, this kind of swirly space galaxy figure thing, which I really love. It's a lovely image. Um, so the two of them did all that work, which is great, and I love. We've got Kelsey Phillips and Lonnie Garcia, who did the art for Beneath the Rotting Sky. And there's this really wonderful thing in the book where, let's see if I can find some examples of this. So, Rotting Sky is here, right? So this is Kelsey's work here, which is a lot of the shots that are kind of like in the camp of the setting, right? The kind of mundane world stuff in the lead up to the like big action of the story, and then Lonnie got tasked with doing all of these things for when they're like off in the really spooky area, and so it's all of this like really graphical blacks. The style gets it's like very divergent in style in this way that's really really fun, and uses color in this really different way. So there's this wonderful contrast of like the normal world, the mundane world, and then the like really fucking weird and scary, spooky, like alarmingly bright and vibrant, like fungal world that they go into, where they're viscerally eating the hearts of these rotting monstrosities to gain power and stuff like that. So the kind of tag team between those two artists worked out really, really beautifully. And then Simon Sweetman did all of the art for On a Sea of Stars, and I've shown a lot of his work in there. Absolutely great artist, and he had a lot of time to give to the project, so he was able to kind of take on one whole series and do a ton of stuff. But also, he did some extra images of like a fictional table of players, which includes this image here where they've the director has their good little cat friend, and they've got their great little laptop with the crescent moon. There's a bunch of really nice details in these images, which he kind of hopped on last minute to fill out. And I think the other one's up at the front here. Yeah, so like he did this all four series together thing, and then also this one here is Simon. And I really love the energy he brought to the characters. These are kind of the fictional players that are doing all the running example stuff. And there are good cats and nice little messy table and, you know, all this kind of stuff. It's a really a very charming set of images that he put together for us. So I do want to highlight those because they're really fun. And then for Maze of Dreams, we had Carly AF and Jabari Weathers doing all of that. And Carly has this really wonderful kind of like graphic black style that they did it all in, which I think is really correct for the series. And they did really great takes on all the characters and their little avatars and stuff like that. So quite enjoy that, and this framing of everything being inside of like shards of broken mirrors. And then Jabari, we couldn't get a lot of their time, and so they just put in one specific image, but it is a really lovely one, and I do want to highlight it. Right, but like Raven's character designs for Brink of the Abyss, really, really wonderful. I especially love this image where the Enigma's alter ego, it's like a throw up that they've done on the wall because they're a street artist. This was entirely Raven's creative mind running with some very vague pitch that I gave her, and she just made it this really awesome and very thematically dialed in image that I love. And like everyone has cool shoes. And then Jabari did this very cool image of this like character reflected in all of these different possible other selves in the dream from Maze of Dreams, which I do really, really love this image as well. So shout out to all the artists who worked on the book. They all did such amazing stuff. And then we brought in Lauren for the cover, and the cover is sick. I'm sure people have seen that if they've gone to the backer kit or anything else like that. I don't have a good image of it in front of me right now, but lovely, lovely, lovely stuff. Do you need cats to play the game? You do not need cats to play the game, but it sure does help. They will be your magical advisors and let you know that you are, in fact, a moon princess. So you probably do want a cat if you're inclined to be a moon princess. That seems important. Happy to clear that up for you. Thank you for the lovely question. So yeah, I'm just very happy and very grateful with the book and how it's all turned out. If you're watching this and you are not in possession of the game, if you're not supporting it on BackerKit, or this is years later and you haven't bought it, check it out. Play the game. I put a lot of work into it, and a lot of myself is in it, and so I would really love for people to engage with it and have fun with it and find things that spark their imagination, bring them joy, bring them closer to their friends, that they might learn something about themselves or whatever the case may be. That's the good stuff. That's what it's all about. So yeah, thanks for everyone who showed up and the people who asked me questions on Twitter and everything else. It's much appreciated. I like to have opportunities to kind of unpack and get into the details of the game where I can, because the book is an incomplete thought in some ways. It doesn't have absolutely everything exhaustively laid out, because it would be 700 pages at that point. So yeah, it's nice to be able to kind of chat with folks. So thank you all for showing up. Catch you later.